Okay, I think, thank you first for having me here, of course, to you and John. But I think what John and Wolfgang pointed out just then is exactly what I've been struggling with the details of this book. And I feel that my contribution, as it stands at the moment, goes down the second path that you mapped on a more conceptual level and thinking about this with a looser idea of what the territory is all about. And I come at this from, I'm not a European specialist, I'm a Middle East studies person, and the Middle East studies has taken a diasporic turn of late. So we're very interested in how the region is formulated through its migrant populations, through processes of migration. We're very interested also in, and have always been interested in, the artificiality of borders. And the borders were created in the Middle East 100 years ago this year, and we're seeing the unraveling of those borders at the moment. So that's the place I'm coming from with this. And my paper was initially meant to solely address what is diaspora and map the state of the field as it is today. And I think it primarily does do this, but I also wanted to start to think about some of the intersection between these two big terms that we're dealing with today, diaspora and democracy. And of course, I wanted to move beyond the fact that they're both Greek words and they stem from ancient times, and they both happen to start with D. But beyond that, I'll start. Now, in addition, before reading John's contribution, I was motivated to think about the ways diaspora can possibly re-energise or help us to rethink democracy away principally from a territorial mentality. In other words, what does diaspora have to offer democracy? And what I think it might offer is two things. Perhaps, not coincidentally, these two things are central elements in diaspora scholarship that have really been thought over and debated amongst diaspora scholars. And as a result of these debates, diaspora studies has taken quite different directions, unsettling some of its assumed foundational ideas. Now, one of them is critical distance, which I'll get to toward the end of my paper, and the other one, which is more important, I think, for us today, is this business of the territory. Diaspora has an interesting and complex relationship to territory. Examining this relationship reveals what I have categorised as the two schools of thought in diaspora studies. And I don't like these words, but I'm kind of trapped by them. The conservative or conventional view and the more progressive view. And before I go into some detail about these two, I want to point out that the tensions between them have neither been fully resolved, nor has one side triumphed over the other. And I think what is actually happening is, across different disciplines in the humanities and the social sciences, the approaches are being used in different ways. So some disciplines are sticking to the more conventional, and others are pushing diaspora into different directions, depending on if you take a more empirical approach, or you feel that you're dependent on your empirical data, or if you're being more theoretical. But I think that this is something that we can change. But now specifically onto territory. As I've argued in the longer version of my paper, oftentimes the scholarship on diaspora overlooks territory or assumes that it has a secondary importance. It's diasporic identity that everyone seems to be obsessed with, but that too is linked with a territorial mentality that underpins this field. I also suggested that territory might be overlooked because of the form it takes, and that form is essentially the homeland, and all diasporas apparently dispersed from an originary location, they came from a homeland. Now, Robin Cohen, a giant in this area of research and one of its pioneers, has made the case that diaspora scholarship is built on the idea of home. Now, this essentialism of the homeland is a key, but not so widely interrogated feature of the more conventional strand of diaspora scholarship. And one of the very foundational essays in this field came out in 1991, was by William Safran, and it was called Diasporas in Modern Societies, Myths of Homeland and Return. It is the most widely cited essay in the field. Safran identified 6 criteria of diaspora, all of which, maybe except one, emphasise a territorial core. And the kind of territorial core that he is interested in is the homeland. He does mention the host state, but more often he's obsessed by the homeland. The first criterion talks about a specific original centre from where dispersion occurs. Later you have the ancestral homeland and then an authentic homeland. These are the terms that he used. So for Safran, without territory, there can be no conception of dispersal. Safran's conception of home is one that is solid. It is one that is built. It takes the form of a designated geographic space, and there is a lot of sentimentality attached to this homeland. Now, I'm picking on Safran. I'm giving him a hard time, apart from the fact that I don't like his typology. His work is widely representative of the conservative strand in diaspora studies, but also his stress on the materiality of the homeland territory and the notion that it is an original centre is even shared by scholars not as resolutely committed to the homeland. So someone like Judith Cheval, she highlights that there's this triangular relationship between homeland, host state and diaspora, but even though she brings the host land or the host state into her discussion, she nevertheless insists that the homeland has primary importance. And one of the reasons I think that the homeland holds such primacy is the way that it is assumed as the rightful place of the dispersed community. The site of origin is always more favourable than the homeland, and it is always seen as secondary. The site of origin is always more favourable than the host state or the places of settlement, and the places of migration are always viewed as secondary, and mainly they should be temporary. Secondary and temporary because host states, as the term suggests, extend their welcome and generosity to diasporas. Diasporas are at the mercy of the host state and the society of the host state, and in the words of Saffron, are never fully accepted by the host society and therefore maintain a sense of alienation. Now in this slide, it is understandable why so many, if not all diaspora theorists in this conservative strand, simply assume that return is the goal. It is a utopian goal, and it is also cast as a remedy to the hardships of living in a host state. Now importantly though, the homeland and these diaspora theorists talk about is not simply a homeland, a kind of nice stretch of land where its inhabitants feel secure and belong. Everybody wants that kind of a relationship to home. But what they're actually talking about is a nation state. And we see this in Saffron's work despite the fact that he never actually uses the word nation state that much. Saffron's explicitly stated argument is that the Jewish diaspora is really the ideal type or the prototypical form. It is the example he uses to build his 6 criteria, which, as I have said, rely on this idea of return to an authentic, or the idea of the authenticity of the homeland. Many theorists have taken aim at Saffron's theologically driven model, but what they have overlooked is that his criteria only make sense, as John Stratton identifies, in Zionist terms and in relation to the Israeli nation state. And in that sense, his assumptions depend in crucial ways on the modern constructions of the nation, or of the nation state and the land. Now, Saffron isn't the only researcher working in the field who kind of slips between homeland and nation state. It is a trend that is more broadly evident in diaspora studies, predominantly in that conservative strand. So why is this a big deal, apart from, why am I saying it's a problem that this literature should be using homeland and host state interchangeably? Well, apart from the fact that it's kind of inaccurate to do that, at a more technical level, as we all know, nation states are afforded a legal and political status in the international system, a status that is not extended necessarily to mythic or nostalgia-riddled homelands. A nation state enjoys a degree of sovereignty through which it can exercise its right to exclude and police the movement of immigrants across borders, as well determined through legislation or racially charged language who is part of a nation's cultural identity. In diaspora studies, the onus of exclusion is often placed on the side of the host state and used implicitly as a justification for why diasporas yearn for a homeland. But the nation-state form that the homeland takes is just as exclusive and prescriptive of the kind of national polity that it wants within its borders. And this, I think, is kind of one of the problems when we think about homelands and homelands being the space to sort of celebrate. It is this recognition of the national homeland's potential to be just as restrictive that prompted, on one level, diaspora scholars in the second, perhaps more progressive strand, to take a critical stance against territory in such a rigid and narrow fashion. If Saffron is representative of that conservative strand, then the key voice, I think, or one of the key voices in this second area would have to be Stuart Hall, who very early on, even before Saffron, wrote his seminal essay, and in it he identified territory as a significant issue for understanding diaspora. And what he argued in this 1990 article called Cultural Identity and Diaspora was, firstly, he stated that diaspora does not refer to those scattered tribes whose identity can only be secured in relation to some homeland to which they must at all costs return. And secondly, he draws out and then challenges the connection between territory and cultural identity. In relation to diasporas tying their identity to a sacred homeland, Hall writes, he accuses that of being, or suggests that this is the old, the imperialising and the homogenising form of ethnicity, And then he adds, we have seen the fate of the Palestinian people at the hands of this backward-looking conception of diaspora. Hall's reference, I think, to Palestine here is not just incidental, but reflects how the example of the Jewish diaspora asserts a particular and limited notion of territory and is seen as so central to, it's like the exemplar of all the diasporas. Hall's criticism of this conception of territory, and I hasten to add that he's not alone, should not be seen, as is sometimes suggested, as a promotion or a celebration of, this kind of detached rootlessness. Rather, what these diaspora scholars are pushing us toward is to not perceive the homeland or the nation state as the sole organising principle of dispersed peoples. They call into question the model of homeland and nation that is put forward by people like Cohen and Safran. Now, from within the field of Jewish studies itself, Daniel and Jonathan Boyren have been assiduous in dismantling the link between diaspora and homeland territory, between national homeland and cultural exclusivity. Although they are ultimately arguing for a similar vision of diaspora put forward by Stuart Hall, they take a very strong issue with Hall's conflation of Jewish diaspora with Zionism. They expose another way of thinking of diaspora and propose something that they term the power of diaspora to undercut certain territorial formations. And they do this through the example of the Jewish diaspora. And what they note is that there has been an absence in the Jewish diaspora of living for centuries inside the homeland. And as such, this has produced a Jewish diasporic relation to the homeland as commemorative, not kin-based or economic, according to their reading. On the strength of this assumption, they argue that the ground, and this is the word that they use, the ground of Jewish identity, need not be expressed through a territorial dimension in reference to a state, but can be used as a resource to eliminate the limitations of tying national identity to a state. I do like what the Boyren brothers' revival or exposure of an alternate history or model within the Jewish culture can do to mount a critique of diaspora. But similar and more assertive arguments can be made by way of other case studies. The African diaspora is a good example. We don't often think of the African continent as having a diaspora, but African migration, starting with the slave trade, set in motion the establishment of a dispersed African community, and Paul Gilroy described this as the Black Atlantic diaspora. This African example, I think, raises two questions. Firstly, given the extensive and complicated web of dispersal that we see in this example, where would today's African Americans, for instance, or Black British people return to? And I think the short answer is we don't really know, and often we cannot know. Consequently, can return to the homeland territory be seen as central or indispensable to our current understanding of diaspora in light of this example? Must diaspora be oriented by a homeland? And secondly, the African example shows us that the assumption of a single originary homeland that precedes dispersal is not always an element of diaspora. Africans that were dispersed did not stem from a single homeland or nation, but from multiple locations. There is an absence of a primary home that Africans in the diaspora can uniformly point to as the place that they were displaced from. So again, you get this destabilising of a very rigid view of territory. Now, what I think we can see in the second strand of diaspora research is that it has conceived of ways to move beyond territory, or at least to reconceptualise it in less rigid and more kind of flexible terms. And this is where I think diaspora can benefit democracy, especially as it has started to pose questions of how cross-border affiliations between displaced communities might transform how we make sense of state borders and state sovereignty. Diasporas can diminish borders by transporting elements of the homeland outward and the host states back into the homeland and then even across the web of diaspora itself. The flow, in other words, is not unilateral. Doesn't go in one direction. It's multi-directional, highlighting that the line or the border between here and there spaces is not so easily definable, even if we continue to see it on a map. Yes, borders do act as physical barriers, but in other ways they are diminished, deterritorialising nation-states as separate pockets of land with corresponding unique identities. Such multi-directional flows are laying the groundwork for what Garrett Wallace Brown refers to as world citizenship that concerns itself with issues of justice and global inequality, for instance. We do not have formal institutions maybe to fully address these concerns. What we do have are expressions of solidarity that transgress national identification and territorial boundaries. Things like Black Lives Matter recognising or endorsing the distinctly diasporic network that is boycott, divestment sanctions for the Palestinians, I think is a prime example. And I think we can refer to these as global schemes of social cooperation that highlight just how national boundaries have less primary or moral significance today. Maybe democracy research needs to recognise the political potential of these non-state actors, diasporas and transnational groups as central to challenging our appreciation of how democracy can operate. Now the next element, the last one, that has emerged from diaspora studies is this thing I'm calling critical distance, and it relates to territory but also extends what diaspora has to offer democracy. Now this notion of critical distance was initially developed to address how diasporas negotiate or merge, for want of a better word, their plurilocal experiences. It was applied to make sense of how geographical and temporal distance from the homeland affords diasporas hindsight to reflect on more undesirable aspects of their homeland. It resonates with earlier theorizations drawn from Edward Said on exile, where he says the exile sees things in terms of what has been left behind and what is actually here and now. This means that an idea or experience is also counterpoised with another. So that's what exile studies sort of had to say. But this initial idea of critical distance was extended principally by diaspora researchers who took the aim at the homeland as a central expression of territory. And from this we get work that talks about diasporas as harbouring a deterritorialised critical consciousness. A diasporic sensibility embodies this deterritorialised consciousness. And it's advocates of people like Lily Chu and Samir Dayal and James Clifford, of course. And what we see here, I think, really is a way of rethinking diaspora beyond a state-centrist model of allegiance to a homeland versus a host state. So it's trying to collapse this idea of you have the homeland and you have the host state, and you're trying to work out which one you're more aligned with, I guess, as a diasporic figure. And what we see here through this kind of formulation is a quest to understand the world and how society or politics operate from the margins, or to adapt George Simmel from the position of the deterritorialised stranger. I think when diaspora research is organised around the idea of return, of displaced communities' endless desire to restore themselves to a homeland, it assumes a vision of the world from the dominant centre. The quest to return is to return to a centre. But what might the world look like? What might the important global or political or social issues be if we understand diaspora as peripheral within an international system that is defined through nation states? Those are the sorts of issues and questions that critical distance gives rise to. And there are a couple of things that critical distance, the perspective from the margin, exposes or achieves, I think, perhaps in relation to democracy. Bonnie Honig has written about the relationship between the foreigner and democracy, and I'm particularly interested in her idea of the foreigner founder that she has elaborated on through her readings of certain texts, where the foreigner restores or refounds this, society that is riddled by corruption. Diasporic subjects, I guess, are not unlike foreigners. While they threaten the supposedly or desired socially homogenous infrastructure or national identity of a democracy, they also point out the exclusion on which democracy is based. And like Honig says, rather than see this outsider as a problem, what if we ask how this marginalised figure can help us to create a more inclusive democratic space and practice? That's one aspect of distance that might benefit democracy. The other, and the one that I will end on, is a bit more difficult to capture or to explain. Sometimes, maybe too many times, critics working on diaspora, and this is true of those who work on diaspora's democratisation activities, assume or state that diasporas from repressive homelands learn about democracy or democratic institutions only after living in a liberal democracy. Generally, it's a Western liberal democracy. Energised and enlightened by this knowledge, they start to organise, to democratise their homelands. I am bothered by this claim because it strikes me as inaccurate. It erases the agency of diasporas themselves, an agency they develop through the experience of displacement and deterritorialisation, of being marginal and understanding the world through marginality, of living in a range of host states and that are not always accommodating, of ultimately coming up against the limits of democracy time and again. The diasporic sensibility that develops out of these experiences, the one that I'm calling critical distance, constantly assesses the shortcomings of democracy's inclusions and exclusions, both in the homeland and in the states that house the diaspora. This is not as simple as saying diasporas learn of democracy by living in a Western-style democracy. To end, as I know I've probably spoken for way too long, I will just say briefly that I think diaspora has something to offer democracy, namely around the way that it has conceptualised territory and its development of this critical sensibility that I've been talking about. it might be one fundamental part of those quantum leaps that John Keane is seeking to reinvigorate diaspora research.
Thank you, Jumana, very much. Yeah, we're taking questions here now. I have some discussion. Yeah, going on. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not from the field of diaspora studies, so I'm not knowledgeable on the topic, but while listening to you, my ultimate question was how do we relate that to Ukrainian diaspora? You know, because we shouldn't homogenize diaspora. You know, diasporas have different experiences, you know, and the Jewish diaspora of the Middle East might have completely different experiences as compared to Eastern European diaspora. And I understand the idea of homeland and nation state, but also if you looked, you know, at Ukraine is in the process of nation building, you know, but if I understood correctly, you are suggesting to discard the idea of nation state, right, to certain extent. So I was wondering whether you can make a connection to the context of Ukraine, right? Because if Ukraine is at the center of the book, right, how can we bridge that?
No, that's a very good question, one that I've been thinking about a lot. I'm not an expert, obviously, on the Ukraine, but I'm not suggesting that we discard the nation state. What I'm suggesting is that diasporas, sometimes, this may not be the case with the Ukrainian one, start to rethink the model of the nation state. You know, they have to contend with the idea that it's going to be a multinational nation state. It's going to be a homeland that is made up of, you know, of borders that are sometimes not so perfectly sealed, that they perforate. You know, they also have to contend with processes of nation building when you have a diaspora that is, you know, dispersed across a range of locations. How do you kind of energize that diaspora community to become part of that process? Now, I completely understand your question, and to sort of make the link to the Ukrainian diaspora is a tough one for me, and it might very well be that the Ukrainian diaspora is in a process of nation building, you know, with a very rigid idea of what kind of nation it wants, and that's sort of why I put that sort of line in my paper to say that homeland states can be just as, you know, exclusionary and exclusive as the hostland state. And diaspora scholarship has tried to come to terms with that in different ways.
I have a question we have heard many times before, I'm sure, but I still think it's essential because all the examples you gave are, for me, prime diaspora examples. But the problem I see is that the term diaspora has now become a catch-all term that is used for all migrants. I find that highly problematic because where would you draw the line between diaspora and migration? Is it actually a diaspora in the case of Ukraine? What about labor migrants? Are they dispersed? Isn't that a voluntary act of migration? And the migrants I study, I will talk about in a minute, they wouldn't call themselves diaspora, they call themselves migrant communities. It's a bit of a politicized term, diaspora engagement, diaspora development. I think it's well worked out in your chapter already, but that's something we should state. How do we define diaspora and how do we situate ourselves in this debate?
So I think your question was something like, you know, how do you draw a line between the diaspora and the migrant?
Can you draw a line?
No, I mean, how does one draw a line? It's very difficult. You know, try to tease out the differences between exile and diaspora and migrants. Do you call it migration studies? Do you call it diaspora studies? It's a very sort of tricky, you know, they're tricky terms to deal with, and they easily sort of lead into each other. I haven't come to a conclusion, of course, of how to separate those two terms out, but I do appreciate that, you know, one is not the same thing. The one thing I would add about diaspora, though, is that you are speaking about a community of people who are dispersed, who do see themselves as having some kind of affinity. And usually that affinity is around a kind of ethnic identity.
Meaning that there is some familiarity with vernacular language, some familiarity, shared familiarity with a sense of history, some familiarity with homeland and its territory, its sunrises and sunsets and the smell of the air. some sense of food, jokes. I mean, they are all qualities, of course, of a nation. I mean, I too have also had this question whether the rethinking of diaspora dissolves the category. Whether it turns it into everything and nothing, or whether it dissolves it as a category, so that in effect it leads to the conclusion, to put it crudely, we're all diaspora. We are all mongrels. We are all, products, lived products of multiple spaces and background identities. I think that would destroy the book. So you can't do it. Or you might try. Or you rethink it in analogous ways to what I'm trying to do with democracy, which is that you think of it as a shared identity that contains within it pluralism and lived. It's a lived identity in multiple nested, interconnected spaces, where the territorial state is part of the process of being a diaspora, and yet it is not, as you pointed out, it's not the Safran relationship, it's not a hierarchy, it's not that the ultimate aim is to return to the homeland. So it's a lived, shared understanding of what it is to be Ukraine or Lebanese, but lived in a kind of mosaic of contexts. And would this satisfy the question? Of course, that people don't call themselves diaspora is not necessarily a reason for not using the term. I mean, social science is a whole exercise in naming things that people themselves don't call themselves. So they may call themselves migrant communities, but...
Yeah, but migrant maybe not as much time. It reduces them the focus on their homeland, something over lunch maybe. To further debate it.
So it's your turn in any case, right? You can respond to...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Can I have a tiny corner? If you think about diaspora and its impact on democracy, then you must address the agency question. Is diaspora an actor, or is it a collection of numerous actors? Do they have the same aims? Do they have the same values? This is certainly a question you have to address.
In the long version of the paper, I do refer to diasporas as non-state actors. Like I see them as actors with agency that are not necessarily linked to formal ways of power or formal understandings that we have of power in institutions. But I do see them as actors in that regard, not just for democratization purposes, but in other sort of contexts as well.
This then may involve the question whether there are organizations.
Perfect question, because that's exactly what I've been talking about now.
May I also say one little thing, Olga?
Yeah, sure. John. Yeah.
I mean, I think Jumana's point that one of the reasons for retaining the category of diaspora is that it has decentering effects on the notion that democracy functionally requires a nation state, that is a more or less homogeneous identity that's housed within a state. And I would have thought that for those of you and all of us concerned about the future of Ukraine, there is a clear political difference. There's a clear political option. I mean, either Ukraine is built as a territorial state within a wider geographic setting where a kind of Kaczynski mentality crystallizes. I mean, this is nation-state building. Or whether it is a much more complex power dynamic that protects the millions of Ukrainians who live inside those borders,
but those people are themselves connected to a multiplicity of spaces of support and contestation outside and beyond. I think that is a very different vision. I'm sorry Wolfgang is not here, because it's a very different vision of what it means to democratize. And, you know, this Kaczynski-Orban tendency is gaining ground in some parts of the territorial space in which Ukraine is trying to find itself. The diaspora literature warns against that simplification, that will to simplify what it is to be Ukraine and what it means to have democracy, because it thinks about the protection of Ukraine within a global setting and in terms of power sharing. I mean, inside Ukraine, but also outside, and the entanglement of those processes. I can see this quite clearly as a vision.
I guess the other quick point I wanted to make, and I didn't say it explicitly because I was protecting myself a little bit, I said that diaspora is used differently in different disciplines. Okay? And I do think that in the more social science mode, political science mode, it does take that more conservative approach, what I've termed the more conventional approach, because what you're looking at is empirical data. And I am wondering if the data that you're looking at, or the information that you're collecting from, you know, real life examples, for want of a better way of phrasing it, might not be perceived in a different way or narrated in a different way. That's sort of what I'm suggesting, that it does not just have to be perceiving this diasporic network or diaspora community of Ukrainians living in X, simply working towards establishing a nation state and democratizing it in a particular way. And I do think also that nation state building is something different to the question of democracy in some ways. That's sort of what I was agitating for, I guess, or trying to be a little bit provocative about. I could be, you know, going down the wrong path, because as I said, the Ukraine is not my area. I don't know that much about it, but I just thought I would put it out there.
Thank you, Jumana. Yeah,
There's another way of saying the same thing, which is that in the literature on territory, I'm very struck by this. Haushofer is one, Carl Schmitt is another, Max Weber. You know, there is a way of seeing territory as a kind of in itself. It's like a fact. It has facticity. It is like this table. Territory is territory. And I don't think, when you read Charles Mayer's book, I think actually